Hello and welcome to today's race edition of the Race Weekend Data Analysis for the Emilia-Romagna del Made in Italy Grand Prix edition that we saw just yesterday. Now, if you're not familiar with this race edition and how exactly this runs, I basically collate all of the data, all of the lap times, the positions, the gaps, etc. like that, and I pit the two teammates against each other and see exactly how well they fared against one another. Now, this is a slightly longer episode than normal because there is just that much more data to crunch, so each of the teams are going to be timestamped, so you can skip to whichever one you would like me to talk about. But if you're interested in my opinions of this weekend's Grand Prix, check out the video of my driver rankings, in which you can also get involved and rank the drivers down in the comments below. But without further ado, we will jump on into today's episode and remind ourselves of the Grand Prix results. It was Max Verstappen taking the Grand Prix victory 22 seconds exactly ahead of Lewis Hamilton, with Lando Norris in P3, then the two Ferraris, Daniel Ricciardo, and actually Pierre Gasly getting P7 in the end, as Lance Stroll received a post-race penalty, adding 10 seconds to his race time, and then also Kimi Raikkonen received a 30-second post-race penalty as well, biffing him all the way out from P9 down to P13. But converting all of this race data into a positional chart to see where everybody stood at the end of each lap, we produce something that looks a little bit like this. We can see all of the position changes and especially the big loss from Lewis Hamilton at lap 30 in the middle, rising all the way down to P9. That's actually only as far as he fell, down from P2 all the way to P9, stuck in the gravel for about 30 odd seconds or something like that. And then we had, of course, the red flag period, and then we lost Sergio Perez. He had a big steep increase as well, and then Lewis Hamilton at the end fighting his way back through the field. And similarly, converting all of the lap times for this Grand Prix, we can create a chart that looks a little bit like this. Now, in the first 6 laps, we can see the safety car lap times that are set around 145 seconds, and then the safety car comes in, and the lap times are just below 105 seconds, around 95 seconds as well. And then slap bang in the middle, we can see the long pause for the red flag period, and then also the start under the rolling start for the safety car as well, and then we have the dry portion of the race. Now, I can zoom in a little bit on this section and we can see and highlight some certain sections. And the first one to point out is the enormous pace difference between Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton in the first 20 or so laps. They were on average 8 tenths to 1.2 seconds faster per lap than anybody else in this section of the Grand Prix, until around lap 16 when Charles Leclerc started to go a little bit faster, and also Sergio Perez, and they started slowing down when it was becoming that sort of slick immediate weather where it was drying up a little bit. People were taking the gamble to go onto dry tyres. We then have this area in the dark green where everyone's all around the similar pace, all pitting, etc., until we end just here, and we can see again that Max Verstappen is much quicker than everybody else, but Lewis Hamilton is occasionally popping in there too, only when he's not in traffic of everybody else. But interestingly, right at the very end, and probably the only time it's occurred this Grand Prix, by these red arrows, we can split it up into each individual bands of racing. Now, I do like talking about the bands of racing, as you've got the first band, which is usually the front runners, then you've got the middle band, which is all of the midfield runners, and then you have the slower band, which is the people that are running at the back. Sometimes this splits into 4, depending on if there is an upper midfield and a lower midfield in the Grand Prix, but usually there is 3 bands of racing, which we can just see at the end of this Grand Prix here. But now heading into the section of the video where we break down each of the teams, and we start with Mercedes. Now we're going to start with the graph in the bottom right, which is the percentage pace difference graph. So the way that I calculate all of this is I take all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, I divide them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, and then anything that is over 100 is when Lewis Hamilton is going quicker, and then anything that is below 100 is when Valtteri Bottas is going quicker. Those then get ordered from highest down to lowest, and then we have this graph down here in the bottom right. And I can split this graph down the middle with this blue line and determine that for 13.3% of the laps that the two Mercedes drivers were running together, that was just 30 laps overall, Valtteri Bottas was the fastest car, and therefore for 86.7% of the time that they were running together, Lewis Hamilton was the faster Mercedes. But now turning our attention to the lap chart up in the top left, we can highlight this section where the safety car was out, and therefore on the gaps chart just below it, the gap was hovering around 12-ish seconds, mainly because of the large positional difference down from P2 for Hamilton to P10 for Valtteri Bottas. However, the second section of racing is between these two light green arrows, and we can see that on average Hamilton is roughly 2 seconds per lap. In some places, on average probably over this 26-30 lap period of time, it probably averages at just below 1 second per lap. He is much quicker than Valtteri Bottas. Mainly Valtteri Bottas is stuck in traffic, and that is rising this gap from about 10 seconds all the way to almost 80 at the point of Valtteri Bottas's crash. And that is just absolutely crazy to see that difference that either traffic makes or also the driver makes. It's probably a small little combination of the two. The fact that Lewis Hamilton is one of the better or one of the best wet weather racers on this current grid, and then also Valtteri Bottas not being one of the best wet weather racers on the track, and then also being stuck in traffic. However, Valtteri Bottas did end up retiring, and there is no other data to compare for the teammates. However, we do have this dotted line, which is the 2020 Imola Grand Prix lap time charts for the fastest car, which just so happened to be Hamilton, and we can see by this dark green arrow that in the dry portion, in the second half of the race, they were just a little bit slower than they were last year. And then heading from Mercedes charts, we take a look at Red Bulls instead. And again, starting with the percentage pace difference chart, we split this down the middle, and for 23.8% of the race, Sergio Perez was the faster Red Bull, and for 76.2% of the race, it was Max Verstappen. And once again, turning our attention to the safety car period of the lap, where the gap hovers just below 10 seconds. Again, that's the positional difference between first and P4 for Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez. But then, interestingly, slightly different to Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. Between these two green arrows, Sergio Perez is actually quicker than Valtteri Bottas was to their teammates, if that makes any sense. So Sergio Perez was closer to Max Verstappen than Valtteri Bottas was to Lewis Hamilton, even though they weren't all in clean air. And this explains this small little rise in the gap up to about 30 seconds. However, even before all of the pit stops and the red flag, Sergio Perez starts to go quicker than Max Verstappen in a little bit, as Verstappen was starting to complain about the conditions and wanting to go to dry tyres. He did have a small advantage over Hamilton at that time as well, so he was probably just coasting all the way to the end, to the point where he could change over tyres. So the gap hovered around 30 seconds for a good number of laps, up until the very confusing pit stop stage, which is highlighted here in yellow, which plays all sorts of havoc with the gaps chart, with Max Verstappen coming into the pits, lowering the gap, then Sergio Perez coming into the pits, raising the gap, then the red flag, lowering the gap again. It just plays havoc with it. And then finally, to highlight here, between these two dark green arrows, is the consistency of Max Verstappen after the red flag start. We can see his lap times are very consistent, and just improving and improving and improving, whereas Sergio Perez wasn't so consistent. He was sometimes as quick as Max Verstappen on lap 50, for example, but just not consistent in any way, shape or form, and this is evident in the gaps chart, raising from 30 seconds all the way up to 70 seconds at the end of the checkered flag. And so heading from Red Bull, we now take a look at McLaren, and once again we start with the percentage pace difference graph, and we split this down the middle, and for 12.7% of the Grand Prix, Daniel Ricciardo was the faster McLaren driver, and therefore for 87.3% of the Grand Prix, it was Lando Norris, an absolute ass whooping from Norris down to Ricciardo. Again, this could be down to the fact that Ricciardo is still getting used to the McLaren car, so we can still give him a couple more races, but it was definitely an ass-whooping performance. However, we actually start with Daniel Ricciardo over on the positions chart in the top right. He actually started in front of Lando Norris, and if we then turn our attention to the gaps chart, we can see this vaguely starting to come down, as between these sections in the light green arrows, they're fairly neck and neck. Lando Norris is maybe a touch faster on average overall by just a few tenths of a second, but they are overall fairly even, which is shown here by the gap gently coming down from 5 seconds down to practically nothing. And then we have the team order switch just here where they switch positions, and then it is evident that just after they made the absolute right decision, because Lando Norris was then about a second a lap, half a second a lap faster than Daniel Ricciardo consistently up until the manic phase of the Grand Prix. Then, like we had on the Red Bull chart, we've got the manic peaks and the troughs with the pit stops and the red flag period. And then post-red flag, we have this section between the two dark green arrows where once again Lando Norris and Daniel Ricciardo are actually both consistent. Both very consistent, it's just Norris is a lot quicker. And then this is shown in the gaps chart by the gap raising from about 5 seconds post-red flag all the way up to 25 seconds at the end of the Grand Prix. And then leaving McLaren, we take a look at Aston Martin. And once again, we start with the percentage pace difference. We split this down the middle, and for 70.5% of the Grand Prix, Stroll was the faster of the two Aston Martins, and therefore for 29.5%, it was Sebastian Vettel. This has been the story so far this season in the two races that we have had, but once again, it's Vettel getting used to a brand new power unit, it's Vettel getting used to a brand new style of car, so we can give him a couple more races to get used to it. And obviously they both had inherent brake issues and brake-by-wire problems, gearbox issues as well, so it wasn't a flawless race by any stretch of the imagination. But again, turning our attention to the first portion of the race where the safety car was out, the gap was hovering around 20 seconds, where Lance Stroll was P7 and Sebastian Vettel was all the way at the back. But the first thing to highlight interestingly is this small mistake from Sebastian Vettel on around lap 12. I'm not 100% sure what this actually was, but he was a couple of seconds slower than Lance Stroll in this lap, which equates to this small little bump in the gaps chart highlighted by the light green arrow. We then unfortunately have Sebastian's 10-second stop and go penalty, which raised the gap to almost 2 minutes between the two cars, and unfortunately this has slightly skewed the graph a little bit and we can't really see a lot of the detail as each of the horizontal lines, rather than being 5 seconds, is actually 20 seconds. Then post red flag, this gap is absolutely slashed and we basically go back to racing lap 0, and then between these two grey arrows it is Lance Stroll who is by far the more consistent of the two Aston Martin cars. Sebastian Vettel is just as quick on some of the laps, if not a little bit quicker, but he's just not very consistent at all, and then obviously he has his small little retirement at the end due to his gearbox issues, and this means that the gap rose from just over nothing to about 20 to 30 seconds. And then leaving the two Aston Martin cars with their struggle bus of a Grand Prix weekend, we take a look at Alpine. Now, Alpine were actually fairly evenly matched. If we split the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 57.1% of the Grand Prix, it was Esteban Ocon that was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 42.9%, it was Fernando Alonso. So we start the Alpine charts with the section under the safety car where it's Fernando Alonso leading Esteban Ocon with the gap around 2 seconds by the time the safety car comes in, and then they actually have a positional change on track. Whether this was an actual on-track overtake, a team order or a pit stop, not 100% sure. I would imagine it was actually an on-track overtake for Esteban Ocon on Fernando Alonso. And then we've got this section here by the red arrow on the lap chart where they're trading sort of fastest laps, but Esteban Ocon manages to creep that gap up to just over 4 seconds up until the pit stop phase where we do have this sort of manic Ocon coming in first, so Alonso ends up with the huge gap of about 16 seconds, but then Alonso immediately comes in and then the gap disappears. Then we get the red flag and it just, it's played havoc with all of the statistics, this red flag, and just before it, all of the pit stops. There is then a final positional change just here around lap 40/41 where Esteban Ocon gets back past Fernando Alonso, and then even after this they are just very evenly matched. There isn't really anything to separate them and the gap stays between 2 seconds and nothing. And so from Alpine we take a look at the Scuderia and Ferrari. And splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 47.6% it was Carlos Sainz who was the faster of the two Ferraris, and for 52.4% it was Charles Leclerc. And again we begin with the safety car start, where the gap stays around 10 seconds, again due to the positional change and the difference between the two drivers, Leclerc being P3 and Carlos Sainz being P8. However, when the safety car comes in, Charles Leclerc is able to extend his lead over Carlos Sainz to 30 seconds. However, as the intermediate conditions start to get a little bit drier, they are very, very evenly matched, and this 30-second gap stays exactly the same up until the manic section of the Grand Prix, like I've discussed before, all of the pit stops and then the red flag period, which is highlighted here in the yellow, where the gap extends to a peak of 65 seconds. Then post red flag, where they are actually running P3 and P4 until Lewis Hamilton gets past them, they are just evenly matched. There is literally nothing to separate the two Ferrari cars, and then this is shown here by the gap being around 2 seconds for the whole duration of the last half of the race. And then from Ferrari we take a look at Alfa Tauri. And as always, splitting the percentage pace difference down the middle to begin with, we can see that for 54% of the Grand Prix, Yuki Tsunoda was the faster of the two Alfa Tauris, and therefore for 46% of the Grand Prix, it was Pierre Gasly that was the faster of the two cars. Now this is very, very interesting. I would not have thought this in a million years looking at the two performances. And of course we'll start with the safety car period where the gap is around 12 to 15 seconds, and then the first thing to highlight after that is the pit stop for Mr. Pierre Gasly where he gets off of those stupid wet weather tyres and comes onto the intermediates, and then straight after that pit stop they are just evenly matched, and the gap for about 10 laps or so stays at exactly 40 seconds. And then highlighted by the yellow, we have the stupid pit stop section of the Grand Prix where people come in, then the next teammate comes in, then we've got the red flag, and again it just plays havoc with the timing sheets. And then finally, post red flag for the two AlphaTauri cars, they are sort of evenly matched, with I suppose Yuki Tsunoda being a little bit quicker on average over this section of the Grand Prix, where the gap just sort of fluctuates a little bit. It doesn't really come down and it doesn't really go up. It sort of stays around 20 seconds, maybe coming down to 15, but then maybe going up to 25. It just fluctuates quite nicely. So a very, very even display from the two AlphaTauri cars. And then heading from AlphaTauri all the way down to Alfa Romeo. Now again, Alfa Romeo was one of these extremely evenly matched teams. We split the percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 46.8% of the Grand Prix, Giovinazzi was the faster of the two cars, and for 53.2% it was Kimi Räikkönen. And as always, starting with the safety car period, the gap stays around 2 sort of seconds, but then immediately after the safety car comes in, they're even. There's literally nothing to separate them. Even when one car goes faster, the other car matches. Even when one car makes a little mistake and goes a little bit slower, the other car does exactly the same. And that is shown by this gap literally not changing at all. Maybe going from 2 seconds at the beginning to just under 5 seconds at the end until the pit stop phases. Where just here it is a small little swap where Kimi Räikkönen comes in first, then Giovinazzi, and then Giovinazzi comes in and Kimi Räikkönen gets back past. However, unfortunately for Giovinazzi, he did have to come back in for a rear brake duct issue, whether it was cooling tape or something like that, I'm not 100% sure. This rose the gap all the way to 30 seconds. However, post this incident, after this little pit stop that he had, they were again evenly matched. Both drivers had one small little mistake, Kimi Räikkönen on lap 46 and Giovinazzi 10 laps later on lap 56. And the gap again just stays between 30 and 25 seconds for the whole duration of this period. And then penultimately for the race edition of today's race weekend data analysis, we take a look at Haas, and finally we actually have some data for Haas, as 3 weeks ago we had absolutely nothing. Splitting this percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 24.6% of the Grand Prix it was Nikita Mazepin that was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 75.4% it was Mick Schumacher. And we do start with the safety car period first, but I'm actually going to highlight the positions chart and the gaps chart, where it was Mick that made that unfortunate mistake, losing his front wing, and then unfortunately and very stupidly not being allowed to pit, even though he's got no front wing, making him do another entire lap behind the safety car where he still can't pit and fix his car, which I thought was a little bit mean, but the gap rose all the way to 40 seconds in favour of Nikita Mazepin. However, when the race resumed after the safety car period, Mick Schumacher absolutely floored Mazepin. The gap between them was sometimes 2 or 3 seconds per lap in favour of Mick Schumacher, absolutely rinsing this gap down from 40 seconds to nothing, passing him and raising it to 40 seconds again. That is absolutely ludicrous speed from Mick Schumacher compared to Nikita Mazepin. However, after all of his hard work, Mick Schumacher comes into the pits first, slashing this gap to below 10 seconds. Then a couple laps after, Nikita Mazepin comes in, which raises the gap all the way to above 40 seconds again. And then we have the red flag period, which slashes the gap yet again to nothing. And then post red flag, we can again see between these two yellow arrows the consistency of Mick Schumacher versus Nikita Mazepin in lap times, and also Mick Schumacher being just that little bit quicker per lap, every single lap, until the end of the Grand Prix, steadily raising the gap from just over nothing all the way to over a minute, onwards of 70 seconds. And then finally for today's episode we take a look at Williams, and unfortunately there's nothing. And even the one car that did actually get some data, it's not a full race's worth of data, which is a little bit unfortunate, but that is how we have to end today's episode. And there we go, there is the conclusion of today's race weekend data analysis, all done and dusted. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.